Good afternoon, folks. This is going to be our first part of our lesson on nervous tissue and the nervous system. If you were following along with my handouts on the Blackboard site for this course, then the relevant handout here is the one entitled Nervous Tissue. So you might want to keep that handy as you're going along here to have access to the spellings of important terms and a couple of diagrams, although I'll be putting a couple of those diagrams up on the screen to follow along with. Now, the nervous system is going to be the chief directing system of the human body. It is one of what we think of as control systems that direct the actions of other bodily systems. The other control system of the body being the endocrine system, which we'll be talking about in the not too distant future. Now, the nervous system, you might say, is the primary control system. The endocrine system is also a control system, but it is subordinate to the actions of the nervous system and ultimately is going to be directed by it. And they are going to be controlling bodily actions in different ways. The nervous system is going to be an electrical control system. It is going to be directing bodily actions by sending out coded electrical impulses, whereas the endocrine system is going to be directing bodily actions via hormone signals, sending out chemical signals which travel through the bloodstream in order to control what is going on in bodily systems that are remote from the gland that released the hormone signal. The nervous system is going to consist of a variety of structures that are responsible for responding to stimuli by sending out chemical and electrical signals very, very rapidly from the point of stimulus to organs capable of processing that signal and then uh, indicating and transmitting a response to other organs capable of responding to that stimulus. Now, ultimately, the nervous system has three basic categories of activity that it does, which correspond in some ways, actually very directly, to the three steps of the nervous system response. One, the nervous system receives information, which we would call sensory inputs, and that's the first function of the nervous system, as well as the first step of the nervous system response. The nervous system is going to receive data about the environment through a variety of sensory organs, as well as smaller sensory receptors scattered through the body. Some of that information is information about the body's external environment, information about, say, sounds happening around us, visual data received about objects in our vicinity, temperature data, information about the textures and pressure of objects around us. Also, some of that information is internal data collected about the internal environment of the body itself, information about the chemistry of your blood, information about whether you are hungry, thirsty, full, etc. So some of the data you're collecting is internal, some of it is external, some of it you are consciously aware of, sounds that you hear, things that you see. Some of that information you are never consciously aware of. The nervous system is monitoring data that you have no conscious awareness of whatsoever, such as things about changes in your blood pressure. Your brain is monitoring that even if you are not ever consciously aware that that change is happening. The nervous system is aware of it. That sensory data is being collected by all of these sensory organs and receptors, and then being transmitted along sensory nerves to the spinal cord and the brain. We refer to that pathway as the afferent direction. And that's an important term, that whenever you have flow moving towards the brain and spinal cord and the nervous system, we say that data is flowing in the afferent direction. Put that term in the chat here. And you'll find that term also in your handout for this. Now, Also, that's a term afferent. You're going to see that term with indicated in other chapters, anatomy and physiology later. Blood flow towards a structure is considered to be afferent blood flow. Lymphatic fluid flowing towards a structure is considered afferent flow. Anytime you got anything moving towards something else in the body, we consider that to be afferent flow, whether it's data, fluid, or whatever. So that's the first step of nervous system function, is sensory inputs. Once sensory data is received, then we have the second step of nervous system function, which is information processing, sometimes referred to as integration. That step is going to be carried out by the brain and to a certain extent by the spinal cord. Once sensory data is received, those central processing organs are going to integrate this data together, put it together with other incoming data, compare it against stored data from previous knowledge and memories in order to put together an interpretation of what the meaning of that data is and gain an understanding of what is happening in the environment around you or your own internal environments. Make a determination about what the significance of the data is and what, if any, response is required. In other words, what do you have to do with your body to respond to the data? Do you have to make some kind of internal adjustment in the body? Do we have to do something internally to adjust your blood pressure, your temperature, or other internal bodily parameters? Do we have to make some external change in our environment or our behavior to respond to some outside stimulus? Move a body part, initiate a muscular response, whatever. One way or another, the central nervous system is going to be making determinations about what needs to happen, what that data is going to mean, what we need to do about the data, if anything. Sometimes information processing will determine no response is needed. Not every piece of data that is brought in by the sensory input is relevant. And sometimes no actual change is needed in response to it. But if a change is needed, then these processing organs, the brain and spinal cord, will issue commands. They will determine what response, if any, must be made by the body, what changes need to be made internally or externally to respond to that information. Part of this integration process includes also the process of learning, forming memories, and storing data in response to this new information coming in, as well as the important process of forgetting things. Not all data is relevant, and therefore irrelevant data is discarded. Filtering the incoming information and determining what needs to be stored long term and what can be dismissed is just as important as anything else. And then finally, we have motor outputs. That is the third and final step of nervous system activity and the third major function of the nervous system, which is the process of issuing instructions to the body. That once the brain and spinal cord have made a determination about what needs to be done in response to any kind of data coming in, that we're going to send signals out from those organs along outgoing what we call motor nerves. And those motor nerves are going to direct instructions to whatever body parts need to carry out the instruction in question. Data flow exiting the brain and spinal cord is said to be going in the efferent direction. So afferent flow comes in, efferent flow goes out. And once again, we use that same terminology with regards to the flow of, say, blood away from an organ or structure, or lymphatic fluid away from an organ or structure. Afferent means in, efferent means out. So instructions will go in the efferent direction away from the brain and spinal cord towards whatever organ or structure is going to carry out the instruction, sending out the needed command. Whatever structure carries out a command for the nervous system is going to be called an effector. And you will find that nearly every effector in the body is going to be either a muscle or a gland. Whether that muscle is a skeletal muscle or a smooth muscle, But one way or another, just about everything that we do in response to a decision made by the nervous system involves either moving a structure in the body, whether internal or external, or stopping moving a structure in the body, or it involves secreting some kind of chemical that will initiate a change in the body, in which case a gland is involved, or it involves stopping secreting a chemical to make a different kind of change. So, either way, muscles and glands are the primary effectors that are initiating the commands of the nervous system. So, those are our three steps of nervous system activity and the three broad categories of things the nervous system does: sensory input, integration and processing of data, and motor outputs. Obviously, under that heading, we're incorporating a very wide variety of smaller activities, but that largely encompasses the things that the nervous system does to help our bodies maintain homeostasis. And in doing so, the wide variety of things that are needed to command the body. So, what do we include under the heading of the nervous system? Now, our nervous systems can be divided structurally and you might say functionally as well into two divisions. There are two basic divisions of the nervous system. We can talk about the central nervous system, or CNS for shorts, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. And those abbreviations are very commonly used in the field of neurology. Neurology is the scientific and medical field that studies the nervous system. Your nervous system doctor for any problems related to a nervous system problem is your neurologist. Now, the central nervous system is the part of the nervous system where the processing and integration functions are carried out, where all the decisions are made. Central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Note the spelling of spinal cord, it is C-O-R-D, not C-H-O-R-D. Now, the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is going to consist of all those structures involved in carrying out the other two aspects of nervous system function, that is sensory input and motor output, getting the data to the central nervous system for processing, and then sending the commands out from it. The word peripheral means off to the side of. Now, the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is going to consist of, obviously, nerves, which are the data cables transmitting the signals. It's going to consist of structures called ganglia, singular form if you're talking about just one of them, ganglion. A ganglion is going to basically be a cluster of neuron cell bodies. You might think of it as kind of a relay station outside the brain that multiple nerves branch off from. And all of your various sensory receptors are part of the peripheral nervous system as well. Some of those sensory receptors are going to be complex sensory organs, like the retina of the eye or the cochlea of the inner ear. Some of those sensory receptors are going to simply be nerve endings or other tiny patches of tissue scattered throughout the tissue of your body that are sensitive to temperature, pressure, or other stimuli that are able to gather sensory data and broadcast that data back to the brain. Now, I want to show you a little chart here. And I'm going to pull this chart up to kind of discuss sort of the functional division of the nervous system in a little bit more detail. That's the structural division. Central nervous system is brain plus spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is nerves, ganglia, and sensory receptors. Let's take a look at this at a little bit more of a functional level. This chart that you see is straight out of your handout for today, so you can come back and reference it later. And what we're doing with this chart here is we're breaking down the peripheral nervous system into a somewhat more functional division, talking about the different functions that it carries out, taking a look at the types of activity that we see going on. And in terms of the types of activity we see going on, the peripheral nervous system could be said to have a sensory division and a motor division. The sensory division could also be called the afferent division. It's the aspect of the peripheral nervous system that is responsible for bringing in data to the central nervous system. It's carrying all the sensory impulses, all of the data collection that's been happening from the various sensory organs, transmitting that data to the central nervous system for processing. Now, we could further divide up the sensory division into two smaller subdivisions. Sensory division could be split into the somatic sensory division and the visceral sensory division. The word somatic means having to do with the body. The somatic sensory division is largely responsible for collecting sensory data from the bones, the muscles, the skin, the connective tissues like cartilage and tendons and ligaments, as well as from the external environments. For the most part, somatic sensory data is data that you have the ability to be consciously aware of. It is information that can register on your conscious mind. Note that I say you have the ability to be consciously aware of. You're not automatically consciously aware of this. Not every piece of somatic sensory data that you collect will automatically register on your mind. Our brains do a lot of filtering, folks. They will focus on what they deem to be important. They will focus on the data that seems to draw attention. One of the strongly evolved impulses of humanity is to focus on the data that seems most relevant and to filter out background information that does not seem to be particularly important or relevant. And that means that a lot of details that are not actually registering your attention will kind of slide into the background and may not actually register in your conscious mind. They're just not really there, especially if you're deliberately focusing on something specific. You're listening to me lecture right now. You're listening to me talk. Hopefully, I'm registering on your conscious perception. Hopefully, the words I'm saying are registering on your conscious perception. How many of you, in the course of listening to me talk, have consciously noticed the animal skull on the shelf over my head behind me? Maybe a couple of you? Been there the entire time. But it was not drawing your attention, was it? So it registered as a background detail, and your brain filtered it out. It wasn't important, and therefore it didn't stick out. So didn't lodge. That is the example of the kind of filtering our brains do. They don't pick up on things. They filter out details that are not particularly relevant to what's going on. Now, the other side of this is the visceral sensory division. The visceral sensory division is tracking data, the word visceral means having to do with your internal organs, from inside of you. It's tracking data from your internal organs. It's tracking data from your blood vessels. It's tracking all of the data from inside the workings of the body. Now, some visceral sensory data definitely draws your attention. You feel visceral pain. If you've got a stomach ache, or if you've got appendicitis and you're feeling that stabby pain that tells you something is really, really wrong, or if you've got a kidney infection and it's burning in there whenever you pee or whatever. But if you're hungry or if you're thirsty, that's kinds of visceral sensory data that registers on your senses. But a lot of visceral sensory data never registers consciously in your mind. Your brain is monitoring things like your blood pressure. It's registering things like your blood gas levels, the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen in your blood. It's registering things like the pH of your bodily fluids or the levels of critical electrolytes like sodium and potassium. These are things that our bodies are tracking at all time. You actually have specific internal sensory receptors for this kind of stuff, but that sensory data does not consciously register. You don't feel when your body's oxygen levels go up and down, but nonetheless, that is sensory data that the brain is keeping track of. That's visceral sensory data. So some visceral sensory data you get an awareness of, a sensation, as we put it. Other sensory data, you don't. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about the senses in a week or two. Now, the other side of this is the motor division. The motor division is the efference division of the peripheral nervous system, and it is responsible for the issuing of commands to the body. The motor division is sending out signals along motor neurons, motor nerves, in order to give instructions to the various effectors in response to any data that has been processed by the central nervous system to determine what instructions are needed. Now, the motor division, like the sensory division, can be divided up further. We have a somatic motor division and we have a visceral motor division. The somatic motor division is responsible for handling all of your voluntary movements. The somatic motor division carries signals for all of your consciously chosen movements. In other words, it's carrying signals to your skeletal muscles, controlling all of your deliberately selected movements for actions. The somatic motor division also carries signals for involuntary skeletal muscle reflexes, like when your doctor taps your knee with a little rubber hammer and your leg kicks. The signal for that uses the same nerves as the ones used for deliberately chosen movements. So that's the somatic motor division. It is carrying all the signals for your deliberately, consciously directed actions. Then we have the visceral motor division. Now, the visceral motor division, folks, is actually the busiest part of the entire nervous system. In fact, the visceral motor division has its own separate name. The visceral motor division, and I'm going to drop this name into the chat, is sometimes referred to as the autonomic nervous system, or ANS for shorts. Note it is autonomic, not automatic. But the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, also called the visceral motor division, is responsible for handling all of the background things that happen in your body that you do not have to think about. It is managing all of the body's back-end processes that are going on without your conscious intervention, without you having to make any decisions about them, and without you having any direct control over them. In other words, the visceral motor division, the autonomic nervous system, is doing things like keeping your heart beating, making sure that you keep breathing, processing your food with your digestive organs, making sure that your kidneys continue filtering out wastes, keeping your immune system operating, managing the production of enzymes and hormones by your various glands and organs that do those things, managing the multitude of processes carried out by your liver, all of the growth and healing activities of your body, all of those various unconscious internal management functions of the body that you do not think about and that you cannot think about. You cannot say to yourself, oh, geez, I better make more insulin right now. I just ate a whole lot of sugar. You cannot say to yourself, oh, man, I got badly cut up, in that fall the other day. I better speed up the healing process and make that go. The autonomic nervous system is managing all of that. So it's the uh, internal structural management of all of the background unconscious activities of the body. It is the single busiest part of your nervous system. Now, we can further divide up the autonomic nervous system in two types of bodily responses. There are two modalities of responses that the autonomic nervous system engages in. And I should point out, these are not like a toggle switch. It's not like your body goes into one mode or the other mode. Both of them are active to a certain extent all the time, although there are times when one or the other mode is dominant. We can talk about the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division. Now, the sympathetic division, also referred to sometimes as the sympathetic response, is sometimes called more colloquially the fight or flight division. This is the response of the autonomic nervous system that activates when the body needs action. The sympathetic division is going to be activated by adrenaline type hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine. It is going to activate when you are angry, when you are excited, when you are frightened, when you are sexually aroused, in any situation in which the body needs to prepare itself for action. What does the sympathetic division do? The sympathetic division is going to stimulate heart rates. The sympathetic division is going to stimulate increased breathing. The sympathetic division is going to elevate blood pressure. The sympathetic division is going to increase your awareness of your environments. The sympathetic division is going to reduce blood flow to the skin, because that means less likelihood of bleeding whenever you are in action mode and might hurt yourself. It is going to increase blood flow to your lungs to bring in more oxygen, and it's going to increase blood flow to your skeletal muscles in order to make them better ready for whatever action might be coming. It is going to reduce blood flow to your digestive organs and your urinary organs, because when the body is preparing for action, it is deprioritizing background housekeeping activities like digestion and waste processing, and saying, right now, we need to devote resources to dealing with whatever threat, concern, or activity demands action mode right now. Sympathetic division is often said by anatomists to be concerned with the four F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and mating. That's one of the oldest jokes in anatomy. I didn't make that one up. But regardless, getting the body primed for action, ramping up its systems, increasing the blood flow to all those structures that will make you ready to act. Fight or flight. Fight the thing or flee, run away from the thing. Now, if the sympathetic division is fight or flight, The parasympathetic division could be called rest and digest. Parasympathetic mode is the opposite. It is cooling things down. It is slowing things down. It is preparing the body for rest. It lowers heartbeats. It slows breathing. It relaxes muscles. It calms systems. It basically prepares the body to go into a rest mode. Now, it does, however, stimulate certain activities. Because if we are not prioritizing action, that frees up resources for internal housekeeping. What that means is that we're reducing blood flow to muscles, we're reducing blood flow to the lungs, but we're going to stimulate blood flow to the digestive organs. We're going to stimulate blood flow to the urinary system. We're going to stimulate blood flow to the lymphatic and immune systems. Basically, in the parasympathetic mode, the body is going to take care of its internal maintenance and processing activities like digestion, growth, healing, because we don't have to prioritize action in that moment. So, what we're instead going to do is prioritize caretaking activities, um, processing meals, healing from injury, taking care of diseases, clearing out wastes, that sort of thing. So like I said a couple of days ago, the body has limited resources. It cannot allocate maximum resources to everything at every moment. So we're going to route them where they are most needed at a given time. And when we are not in action mode, we're going to reprioritize those resources for maintenance mode. So that's what the parasympathetic division is all about. Now, again, this is not a toggle switch. This is not like your body is either in sympathetic or parasympathetic mode at any given moment. Both of these kinds of activities are active to a certain extent at all times. Certain organs might be getting more parasympathetic stimulus at a given moment, and certain organs might be getting more sympathetic stimulus at a given moment. There are times when one mode or the other is dominant. When you're sleeping, parasympathetic mode is clearly dominant. When you're in the middle of your workout, sympathetic mode is clearly dominant. So there are going to be times when more or less of this activity is prevalent in the nervous system. But any given structure in the body might be receiving a different amount of sympathetic or parasympathetic stimulus at a given time. And so it's more of a sliding scale between the two than it is your body is all sympathetic or all parasympathetic at any given time. We'll talk more about this later in the course when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. All right. Now, the only way to manage all of this, the way that we make all of this happen, is, of course, by transmitting signals around in the body with the help of a specialized type of tissue. And that, of course, is nervous tissue. I told you all earlier this semester that we weren't going to say a whole lot about nervous tissue at the time that we talked about histology because we were going to do entire chapters about the nervous system later. Well, later is now. So now it's time to talk about this very specialized type of tissue called nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is going to be the dominant tissue that makes up the organs of the nervous system and carries out these specialized tasks of signal transmission and information processing. Now, nervous tissue is not as diverse a tissue type as we have seen with the other tissues we have discussed. It does not have lots of subtypes like connective tissue or epithelial tissue. There's really only one kind of nervous tissue. And it does not have a lot of different kinds of cells in it. There are really only two major cell types in nervous tissue. We have neurons, which are the cells that actually transmit nervous signals. And then we have a category of supportive cells called neuroglial cells. Let me put these terms in the chat. Neurons, which are the actual cells that send signals for the nervous system. Hang on, I misspelled that. There we go, neurons. And then we have neuroglial cells, sometimes referred to as glial cells or neuroglia. Which are the supportive cells which protect neurons and help them to do their job. And there are a couple of different types of neuroglial cells that we're going to see as we go along. Fundamentally, the function of the nervous system is to transmit and process electrical signals. And it is very, very good at doing that. Neurons are going to be the chief cells involved in that. The neuron is the specialized cell that produces, transmits, and processes the electrical signals that are going to be involved in both sensory input and motor outputs. Now, nervous tissue has a couple of specialized properties, some of which you were aware of already because they're shared in common with muscular tissue. Like nervous tissue, muscular tissue is highly excitable. In fact, nervous tissue is the most excitable tissue in the body. Like muscular tissue, it responds to stimulus by generating an action potential. When you stimulate neurons, that is through various sensory stimuli, they will generate electrical signals, which will then be carried along the length of a nerve fiber. That leads us to the second major property of nervous tissue that's shared with electrical tissue, which is conductivity. Nervous tissue is highly conductive. Neurons are able to rapidly transmit electrical signals along the length of the neuron from the point of origin at the sensory receptor to the processing structures, often very far away from that sensory receptor, in the brain and the spinal cord. Likewise, when the brain and the spinal cord issue commands, they're able to broadcast those commands along the length of nerve fibers to effectors that might be located quite remote in the body from where the signal originated in the brain or spinal cord. And then finally, the other major property of nervous tissue that makes it possible for it to do its job, and that is the property of secretion. As you saw when we talked about muscles, neurons do not actually come into direct contact with the cells they are stimulating. When a neuron reaches the end of its nerve fiber, whenever we get to the end of a nerve fiber and we are about to come into contact with the next cell in the chain, whether that cell is another neuron that will be receiving the signal, or whether that cell is an effector, like a muscle fiber that's going to receive the signal from the neuron, what you're going to have is a synapse. Remember the synapse that we had with the neuromuscular junction, which is going to be the point of contact between the neuron and whatever cell it is passing a signal to. But as we saw with the neuromuscular junction, that synapse is not actually a direct physical contact. There is no touching between the neuron and the next cell line. Rather, the synapse is going to have a gap, a tiny little gap, only a couple of nanometers wide, called a synaptic cleft. And that synaptic cleft has to be crossed in order for the signal to be transmitted. Every synapse consists of two parts. The presynaptic neuron, which is going to be transmitting the signal, and the postsynaptic cell, which is receiving the signal. And the postsynaptic cell might be another neuron, or the postsynaptic cell might be an effector, like a muscle or a gland that's being stimulated by the neuron. Either way, to get the signal from the neuron to the next cell on the other side of the synapse, what we have are neurotransmitters. And one of the unique features of neurons is the ability to secrete these specialized chemicals called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are going to do the job of crossing the synaptic cleft, passing the signal from the neuron to the next cell in line. We saw with muscle tissue that there's a specialized neurotransmitter passing signals from neurons to muscles called acetylcholine, ACH. This is just one of many neurotransmitters used by the nervous system. We're going to talk about a few different types of neurotransmitters in the next lesson. There are numerous neurotransmitters used in our nervous systems. If you take more advanced neurology classes, you'll learn about many of them. In the next lesson, not today's lesson, but in the next one, you'll learn about a couple of very common neurotransmitters that are important in our nervous systems and the ways in which they stimulate nervous system action. But the ability to secrete neurotransmitters to pass signals and the ability to use different kinds of neurotransmitters to pass on different kinds of signals is a major feature of nervous tissue. Now, like I said, got two basic kinds of cells in nervous tissue. We've got neurons and we have neuroglial cells. And the type we're going to talk about right now is the main functional cell of the nervous system, which is the neuron, because neurons are doing the hard work. Neurons are the actual transmitting cells that are going to be passing signals from one place to another. Neurons are going to be responsible for picking up the data from a sensory receptor or from another neuron, and then beaming it to the next place in line. Now we can talk about neurons falling into three broad categories. All neurons, and these correspond to the three steps of nervous system function, can be classified as either sensory or afferent neurons, interneurons, or motor or efferent neurons. Sensory or afferent neurons are the neurons of the first stage of nervous system activity. They're specialized to detect particular kinds of stimuli, and they're found in almost every tissue and organ of the body. Sensory neurons originate in the tissues where the sensory receptors are found. They terminate in the central nervous system. Every sensory neuron is specialized to detect a particular kind of stimulus. So some sensory neurons will detect light, like the ones associated with vision. Some will detect heat, so they're sensitive to temperature. Some will detect pressure, so ones that we would be involved in, like our touch receptors. Some will detect environmental chemicals, like the ones involved in your sense of taste or smell. Sometimes the sensory neuron is itself a receptor. The neuron itself picks up the data when stimulated. Other times, the neuron is associated with a separate receptor cell or organ that is actually the thing that is receiving the stimulus. Either way, that sensory neuron is going to be transmitting a signal when it or its associated receptor is stimulated, telling the central nervous system, hey, this type of data has been received. Visual data is coming in, or sound data is coming in, or touch data is coming in, or whatever else. That signal, either way, will be passed on to interneurons, which are found exclusively in the central nervous system. Sensory neurons are found in the peripheral nervous system. Interneurons are found in the central nervous system. They're also called association neurons. And by the numbers, they're the most common type of neuron in the body. About 90% of all neurons are interneurons. They receive signals from the sensory neurons. They will communicate with other nearby interneurons to integrate the data from the incoming sensory neurons, putting it together to assemble a complete image of what is going on in the internal and external environments. They will also not only process the incoming data, but they will then store data as new memories and learning, retrieve data from past experience, and make decisions about what to do about any incoming data. In other words, what response, if any, is warranted. Once decisions are made, they will then issue commands that will be sent out by way of motor neurons. They're the bridge between the sensory and motor aspects of the nervous system. So the inner neurons are basically the processing area. They're where we're going to be doing the thinking. Finally, that leads us to motor or efferent neurons. Motor neurons are going to be originating at the central nervous system, but then branching out into the body as a whole. They will terminate at effectors, at muscles or glands that carry out instructions. The motor neurons will carry the instruction issued by the interneurons in order to allow the body to respond to whatever stimulus has been received. Once a decision has been made, the motor neuron carries the signal to the appropriate effector that will then make whatever change is needed in the body, initiating movement, releasing a glandular secretion, whatever, in order to carry out that change. And in that way, maintain homeostasis. All right. Now, neurons take a couple of different shapes. And in the next lesson, you're going to see a couple of alternative shapes that neurons can take. But what I want to show you right now is the most common neuron structure in the body, and the baseline structure that's going to show you the key parts of a neuron that you need to be aware of. So what you're about to see, and I'm going to put this on the screen, is a diagram of a typical neuron, what we call a multipolar neuron. And this is straight out of today's handout, so you can go back and reference this diagram later. All right, so this is what we call a multipolar neuron, which is the most common type of neuron in the body. And you can see it's got several different parts that we have labeled on here. And you'll see how these parts are modified in a couple of other neurons in the next lesson. But this is the baseline neuron structure that you can expect. There are three main parts to every neuron. We have the cell body right here. We have the dendrites, which are these branching structures attached to it. And then we have the axon, which is this long structure leading away from it. Now let's see a little bit more about these parts in detail. First, we'll begin here with the central mass of the neuron, which is its cell body, also called the soma. Some older texts call it the perikaryon, but that's a term you don't hear often in modern neurology. That's an older term. Most of the time, you're going to see this area called the cell body or the soma. And the cell body is the main mass of the neuron. This is where you're going to find the nucleus. This is where you're going to find the cytoplasm. This is where you're going to find the other organelles. It's pretty typical of most cells. Expect to find many different organelles and things. A couple of things that you will find here that are different than an average cell in your body. You will find that embedded in the cytoplasm, I'm sorry, in the cytoskeleton of neurons, you will find that the ribosomes cluster together to form dark-colored structures called Nissl bodies. Capitalize the N in Nissl, Nissl, named after the dude who discovered it. A thing you will quickly learn in neurology is that although I've said to you a couple times in this class, we're trying to get away from the practice of naming things after people. The field of neurology, as compared to other disciplines in medicine, is very conservative in its naming practices and has retained a lot of the old names that are naming things after people and has not changed them and not modernized the names a lot. So there are still a lot of structures in the field of neurology that are named after the people who discovered them and have not gained a more modern name. And we don't know why the Nissl bodies are found in neurology. We don't know why the ribosomes cluster together that way in neurons, but that's a thing that seems to be. One thing that is notably absent in neurons: neurons do not have centrioles. They are absent in neurons, and as a result, you might recall from your Bio 1 class, centrioles are the organelles responsible for separating chromosomes during cell division. Because centrioles are not present, neurons are non-mitotic. They cannot engage in cell division. As a result, you do not repair lost neurons. The only way your body gets new neurons is through the generation of new neurons from stem cells with the use of a chemical called nerve growth factor, and that typically only happens whenever your body is growing new tissues, not during the healing process. If a neuron is damaged, if a nerve is cut, we do not have a way to heal it. This is why spinal cord injuries are permanent. So if somebody gets their spinal cord severed, they don't walk again. This is why nerve damage tends to be permanent damage. This is why traumatic brain injuries are such a big deal, because your body does not have the ability to regenerate lost neurons because they cannot engage in mitosis. Now, associated with the cell body of the neuron, you see attached to it are these highly branched processes. Remember, a process is any projection away from a structure, just like with bone, called dendrites. Dendrites are these extending branching processes which are going to interface either with other nearby neurons or with a sensory receptor. The dendrites are how data comes into the neuron. It is through the dendrites that the neuron receives information from other cells. So the dendrites will interface with a sensory receptor to pick up information from it, or they will interface with other neurons to pick up information from them. The more dendrites a neuron has, the more data it can receive and take into account whenever information is being collected. The word dendrite literally means little trees. Dendro means tree or branch. And you can see they look like these little highly branched tree-like structures. So these multiple little processes and branches will connect with sensory receptors or with other neurons. So data comes into the neuron through the dendrites. Electrical signals will then pass along the dendrites through the cell body. Now the neuron, we say it's multipolar because it's got lots of poles, lots of branches through numerous dendrites. But then, even if it's got multiple dendrites, all the data exiting the neuron goes out along one singular pathway called its axon. There's one single exiting fiber that leaves the neuron, and this is the axon. The axon is also called a nerve fiber. A bundle of axons from multiple neurons is what we call a nerve. So a nerve consists of the axons of a bunch of neurons bundled together. You see that the axon originates from kind of a swelling on the surface of the neuron. That kind of bulging area on the cell body is called the axon hillock. A hillock is a little hill. And now we have this long nerve fiber stretching away. It's a long, straight fiber, unbranched for most of its length. Occasionally, you'll see a little side branch shooting off of it called an axon collateral. But for the most part, the axon is a single, straight, unbranched fiber. Axons can be quite long. The axon of a single neuron can be up to 2 meters in length. So it can originate from one part of the body and then stretch all the way to the brain, even if it starts down in your foot. Now, along the length of the axon, protecting it, the axon is wrapped up in a protective layer of thick, fatty, insulating tissue called the myelin sheath. We'll say more about the myelin sheath in the next lesson, but the myelin sheath acts like the insulation on an electrical wire. Prevents the electrical signal traveling along its length from grounding out before it gets to where it needs to. The myelin sheath is made up of what are called Schwann cells. These bulgy yellow things you see along the length here are not part of the axon. The axon is a long, straight fiber. These are Schwann cells. Schwann cells are wrapped up around the axon, protecting it and insulating it. They make up the myelin sheath. And they're named after the German anatomist Theodor Schwann, so you capitalize the S in Schwann cell, just like you capitalize the N in Niesel bodies. Now, the Schwann cells do not cover the entire axon. There are tiny, tiny gaps between them. They are called nodes of Ranvier. And this is a mistake here. The R in Ranvier should be capitalized because it's named after a dude, named after the French anatomist who first discovered it. And by the way, a pet peeve of mine, which I'm going to talk about here because this is my place and I get to talk about it, is that it was a French guy who discovered it, and therefore his name is actually pronounced Ranvier. However, I have never once in the entire history of the time I have been teaching anatomy heard anybody pronounce it properly. His name is Ranvier because it's French, and that's how you say that name in French, Ranvier. However, everybody pronounces it Ranvier. They call them nodes of Ranvier. If you try to pronounce it Ranvier, somebody's going to look at you and be like, oh, you're being toity-toity, aren't you? You know, but this is one of those situations where everybody has apparently decided we're going to mispronounce that name and we're just kind of stuck with it. But be aware the proper pronunciation is nodes of Ranvier. But if you pronounce it properly, people are going to look at you like you're being snobby. So nodes of Ranvier are what people call them, but Ranvier is actually correct. But capitalize the R in Ranvier because that's, again, the name of the guy who found them. If there is an axon collateral, if there's a side branch shooting off from the axon, it will originate from one of those. Now, at the end of the axon, it will start splitting into lots of little side branches. We call this the terminal arborization. When something arborizes, it begins to branch like a tree, because arbor means tree. And all these little branches will end in what we call axon terminals, and the ends of those axon terminals swell and expand. And you saw what that looks like when we looked at the axon terminals at the neuromuscular junction, because each of those axon terminals can then connect with and provide a nerve signal innervation to something different. In this way, one axon can transmit a signal to a whole bunch of other cells, because that one signal that traveled down the length of the whole axon can go to all of those branches, and therefore each of those little axon terminals can therefore send a signal at once to, for example, a whole lot of individual muscle fibers that are part of the same motor units. Or it can send that same signal to a whole bunch of other neurons that are in the brain helping to process that piece of data. So this is an example of how one of these neurons would be structured. To carry a signal, the signal comes in through the dendrites. The dendrites allow the collection of data from sensory receptors. The signal passes through the soma, and then all the data flows out along the axon. And then at the end, the axon splits into lots and lots of little branches, ending in axon terminals, and then the axon terminals will interface at various synapses with whatever will be the next cell in line. Muscle fibers, glandular cells, other neurons, whatever. And in that way, having lots of little branches, I can stimulate a whole lot of glandular cells in the same gland at once. I can stimulate a whole lot of muscle fibers that are part of the same motor unit at once, whatever I need to do. Now, this is the most common structure for a neuron. This is what we call a typical multipolar neuron. This is not the only type of neuron structure. There are several other shapes that a neuron can take. You can have neurons with fewer dendrites. You can have neurons with all dendrites and no axon. You can have neurons where the dendrites and the axon are fused together. But that is actually going to be the topic of our next lesson. I'm going to cut this one short because I want to break this up a little bit. In your next lesson, you are going to hear about alternative shapes of neurons. You are going to hear about different kinds of neurotransmitters that can send signals in different ways. And you're going to hear about neuroglial cells, the insulating cells that can help the neurons to carry out their tasks, protect them, and assist them in their functions in the nervous system. All right. I hope you all have a good day, folks. Take care.